Let's bring Jono into our show. His first
Yes.
appearance in the English show.
Woo!
Hello.
Hello, Jono.
How are you doing?
We're doing
It's
good.
been really fun sitting. It's been quite fun sitting backstage, just watching you all do your thing. It's very cool. I love the Wingley update.
Nice.
Did you like
Thank
Mark's
you.
cat?
Oh, it's amazing, amazing. It's so slick as well. Like all this, like all the animations and everything. It's very cool. Big fan.
And I was not familiar with their music channel. Do we have that?
Yeah, of course. Music channel. Yeah,
I'm not
yes.
part of that channel. I will join that.
Yeah, it's private. We didn't invite you. No.
I don't think that
Harsh.
there is such thing.
No one will dare. No one will dare.
So, Jono, I gave like a few sentences about you. I'll let you maybe introduce yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you did a pretty rocking job. I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm just really passionate about communities. I've been doing it for about 20 odd years now, and I used to lead community at Canonical for the Ubuntu project, where I worked with an amazing team of people. And then I went to X Prize, which has these huge incentive competitions, and then I went to GitHub. And when I was at GitHub, I realized I don't want to work for a big company, so I started consulting and doing my own thing. And I was consulting for years. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, Revital, like earlier this year, I launched the Community Leadership Core, which is an accelerator that is designed to help companies get the most out of their community initiatives. And it's been it's been a fun ride because, just kind of like launching something and then just dialing it in based upon feedback from yourself and other members. It's been really cool. I've been having a great time doing it. So
That's awesome. So did you actually start as someone who has a lot of passion to people and communities? Because I know I started as a software engineer, and here I am working with the New England community. What was your journey?
Yeah. Mine was a little odd because I was when I was growing up, I was never really very good at school. Like I got terrible grades. When you grow up in England, you do like your mandatory education that finishes at 16, and then you do a couple of years of what's called A levels, and then you go to university. When you do your A levels, you do 4 subjects, and my grades were 2 D's, an E, and an N. Like an N is where you pretty much spell your name wrong on the exam. Yeah, it's worse than a fail.
What's
and
that?
I just didn't.
We don't see that grade in movies. We only see it.
It was horrendous, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. So, but when I managed to talk my way into university, and when I was there, I started writing for computer magazines. So when I finished university, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I was thinking about becoming a developer, but I'm not that good of a software engineer. And it was either be a developer or try and be a rock star.
Which decade are we talking about?
This was I went to university in 2000. So
Awesome.
yeah. So yeah, my degree is actually in basically CD-ROMs from the 90s. Not useful. So when I was at university, like everybody was finishing university and I was freaking out, like, oh, what are we going to do? And people had ideas for jobs. I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I just ended up writing, and I became a journalist for 2 years.
Oh, interesting.
But it's, yeah. So I used to write for all kinds of magazines, like Linux format, Mac format. But it was really when my brother got me into Linux in 1998. And in Carter, my brother got me into Linux in 1998, and that's when I discovered communities. I'd never heard of people around the world working together, and because growing up in England, we didn't really have in America, like everybody was connected to the internet. I don't know what it was like in Israel, but in England, you had to pay 10 pence a minute to get connected to the internet.
Yeah.
So it was this thing that you wanted to be connected to, but you couldn't get connected to because you didn't have any money. And I fell in love with communities. I was like, I just want to figure out how to do it. And that's when I started building communities when I was like 18. So
really?
Yeah.
How did you fall in love with it? What was what do you like about it?
What I found so exciting was, back then I was just using Windows on my computer, and I heard about Linux. My brother installed Slackware Linux on my computer and then just left. So you replace Windows with it. And I was like, okay, how does this thing work? And I used to work in a bookshop, and I went and bought this book. I've actually still got a copy of it. And in the first chapter, it talks about how people all over the world build this software and they share it with each other. And just the idea of people who've never met each other building software together just blew my mind. I'd never heard of that before. And I was like, how does that work? Like, there's the technical thing, which is interesting. But for me, what I was more interested in was like, how do you create that? How do you get those people together? And it's just, So the first,
Your aha moment for community was by reading the book and seeing that this is possible, not by experiencing something. That's
I'd never experienced it myself. And I think part of it was I was kind of this, without turning this into a terrible biopic of my life. I was just like a regular kid living in England. And when I got into Linux, I was really excited about it, but no one who lived near me knew what it was. So I started getting to know people on the internet who shared this passion, and it built this like tribal thing. Like I worked in this bookshop. I used to get those things where you'd iron on transfers into a T-shirt, and I used to iron on like a penguin image onto a T-shirt and wear T-shirts. Remember those?
Yeah, I remember.
Just so somebody would say, "Oh, is that the Linux penguin?" and then I could talk to them. It was
nice.
The first community I set up was called Linux UK, and it was a community of UK Linux users, which my dirty secret is that I built it in Microsoft Front Page. Because I didn't know how to write it, and I didn't know how to write HTML. And then just as I got to meet people, I was like, wow, I got to meet people who I've been friends with since those days, because we're all passionate about the same thing.
So I have to ask you a question. So it's basically the product that made that good connection. Today in our training, someone said, forget about the product. It doesn't really matter. It's all about what the community folks are getting from the community. So those are completely the opposite. What do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, my philosophy here is, when I think back to those days, and I think the same thing applies here because it's just human nature. When I fell in love with community and open source and Linux and all the rest of it, it reminded me about, like, because I've been into heavy metal for years, right? Like I've been an Iron Maiden fan since I was 9.
Yeah, I can see this about you. It's
And you know, when you meet someone, when I'd meet someone with long hair, or I'd meet someone with an Iron Maiden t-shirt on, you're like, okay, we're connected by this thing.
Yeah.
And I think that what's interesting about communities is that same thing happened to me with Linux, but I just didn't know it at the time. And so to me, when you identify who your audience is, so like if we look at Wing, right, we think about people who are building for the cloud, people who are building applications. Like when you can identify those people and you can understand what they're struggling with and what their interests are, and just culturally, like where everything lines up, like there's in-jokes in tech, right? There's things that we're familiar with that people outside of tech don't know about, like Hacker News, for example. Like when you identify those things and you glue people together around them, I think it builds that sense of unity. And I don't think you need the product for that. To me, where the product's helpful is when, you know, if everybody's using Winglang to build software, brilliant. Now we can have a conversation about that as well. But to me, too many companies, they only focus on the product. And I think we should focus on the things that connect us together. And I always like to start with pain points, like what sucks for your audience? Because if you can help them solve those and you give them some quick wins, you're already starting to get into their mindset.
Right. Interesting.
Agree. I have a question. Diversity is super important and crucial. And it's really challenging. And I was wondering, give me some tips, Jono. How do I make a connection? How do we bring more females to our community? It's really hard.
Yeah. It's such a tricky topic. And I'll share, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I'll share with you what I've learned. So when the topic of diversity comes up, it tends to be very focused on diversity of like human traits that we're born with, right? Like what gender you are, what sexuality you are, where you live, your socioeconomic status and stuff like that. And I think that's really important. But I think it's one side of the coin. Because I think when you build a community, you need to have that, but you also need to have diversity of perspectives and ideas and opinions, right? So if we look at the physical attributes, like if you look at women, for example, right? One of the things it took me way too long to learn was that earlier on in my career, I've always tried to be an ally in diversity, but my approach was like create an environment that's welcoming to everybody. And that's one element that I think is important, right? But I think what is connected to that is also people feel comfortable when they feel represented. So if you come into a community and there's more people like you there, then you feel more comfortable in being in that community. But also building a community where bad behavior is dealt with and where leadership demonstrates the behavior that you want to see, right? Like, so for example, I've always admired leaders who are kind, respectful, courteous, but no bullshit, right? Like being frank and honest and direct, but in a way that opens the tent for everybody. The tricky thing, I think, when it comes to the hardest element of that, I think it's easier to create an environment that's welcoming to everybody, and it's easier to have leaders who do that. The harder thing is the representation, because there are multiple different reasons why there are fewer people of one demographic in a particular space, you know. And I'm especially not an expert here, so take this with a pinch of salt. But you know, I mean, I'll give you an example. Like, there are many people who grow up in rural parts of the world who are not exposed to engineering and technology. They're not on the internet as much. Like the lack of access to available broadband and Wi-Fi was a major issue in a lot of people getting into the open source world. And I think there are similar things that will apply to people of color and women and other folks. So so I think we've got to find the root causes that get in the way and encourage people to kind of come in to increase that representation. But the thing that I think often gets missed out in the diversity conversation is we have to create a marketplace of ideas. One of the things that worries me about some online communities is they become echo chambers where everybody's got the same opinion and the same perspective. And that if you say something different to that opinion and perspective, you're seen as an outsider. And we have to break through that. Like, to me, the greatest growth and learning that we have is when people will challenge us, but in a way that is courteous and respectful, right? So, you know, I want somebody to come into my community and tell me ways in which it can be improved, ways in which it can be better. But I'm only interested in entertaining that if they're going to be respectful and if they're going to be willing to play a role in that as well. So to me, we have to have both.
Yeah. I just want to chime in. As an Israeli, which we're very good at telling our mind, not that good as being respectful, but it's also kind of skewed to the cultural norm that we live in, right? I mean,
right.
I may be considered respectful in Israel. I think I am. I don't know, but I'm not.
Find out.
I'm not considered respectful in United States, in certain parts in the United States. And this is also kind of part of diversity. We need to acknowledge the fact that the norm, we're judging people based on our norm, while every culture has its own norm. So it's complicated, and
it's so interesting you say that, because I was literally talking to my wife about this last night. So Paul Graham, you know, the guy who was at Y Combinator, he posted a tweet talking about British people, and he was basically saying, you know, the stereotype of British people is kind of arrogant, a little bit aloof, that kind of thing. He said, but most British people aren't like that, and that's been my experience as well. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm British, but someone responded in that tweet. Well, someone responded in that tweet thread about the like Stephen Fry, the comedian, was asked about what's the difference between British comedy and American comedy. And he basically said, like, in American comedy, the focal point, like the main characters are like, they're kind of a big deal. Like they are bold and vivacious, and the guy gets the girl gets the guy, or whatever it might be. Whereas in British comedy, the characters are always like the underdog, somebody who wants to get up here and can't quite make it, and that's why it's funny. And I came to this dramatic realization. Yeah, and I came to this dramatic realization last night that, and this gets to your point, is that when you grow up in that environment, like I grew up in England, where being overtly proud of your accomplishments, what you call bragging, is just a complete no-no, where you have to be really, you got to be understated. And if you get ahead of your skis, people will call you on it. When you grow up in that environment, it's hard to break out of it. And I think that is an important element of diversity, is like, somebody who grew up in California and somebody who grew up in Alabama had two very different experiences.
Exactly.
How they grew up.
Exactly. So. Very different. I agree.
So, Jono, you mentioned you were a journalist, and I mentioned that you wrote 2 different books, best-selling books. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the first one, The Art of Community and People Powered are the books that have done most well. I put out 6 books in total. One of them was really bad, like complete career embarrassment, a PHP book that I put out that has a whole story behind it that I won't bore you with. And my first book was Linux Desktop Hacks, which I co-wrote.
What's the name?
Linux Desktop Hacks. Yeah, which I co-wrote in 2006, I think it was. The Art of Community was a book where I really wanted to kind of write your career book. And I did this when I was at Canonical. It was it was 2008 when I put the first edition out. There's been 2 editions. And I thought I kind of knew what I was doing back in 2008. I'd been doing it for a while. This experience of building the Ubuntu community was I felt very fortunate that I'd been able to go through that. And in retrospect, like, I just had no idea what I was doing.
Really?
Like,
interesting.
Yeah. Like, what I've learned, for me, like, leaving Canonical was a touch point in my career, because I left, next year will be 10 years since I left. What I've learned in the last 10 years is 5 times what I learned prior to that.
Wow.
Yeah, just working with lots of different people.
Interesting.
So I did the first edition, and then I learned a bunch. So I did a second edition, and the problem is that the book's like 600 pages at that point. It's massive, and it's a bit old. Like, there's talk of, like, Google Plus is mentioned in that book.
Oh, nice.
So I kept having people like reaching out to me saying, we're interested in hiring you as a consultant. I just bought your book, The Art of Community. I'm excited to read it. And I'd be like, don't read that. And if you're like a founder or whatever, like 600 pages is way too much. So I realized I needed to write a new book, and the kind of thing that you could pick up at an airport, like a 300 pages, what you call a business book. But most business books suck. I didn't really want to write a book where you read it and you're like, okay, what do I do now? So, but I knew that to write a business book, there's a whole process. You have to find an agent. You got to put together a proposal. And it took me 6 months to build the proposal and find an agent. I talked to 200 different agents, and everybody rejected me apart from 3. One guy told me that if I wrote this book, it would end my career, which I thought was interesting. And it took 6 months my proposal was like 33 pages long. It took 6 months to get that together. And then we had 4 publishers interested, and then I settled with HarperCollins. So it was a journey.
Wow.
I don't know if I'd do it again.
You mentioned most business books are terrible. Any book you would recommend, a business book?
Like books that I like?
Yeah.
Business book.
Oh, yeah. So there's a number, like, on very different topics. Like, I'm a big fan of Stoicism. So, like, The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday, The Daily Stoic, I'm a fan of. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, I think, is an amazing book, despite the horrible title. There's a really, really worse title. There's a book called The $1 Million Consultant, which I read when I started out. My friend, who sadly is not with us anymore, recommended it for me. yeah, and then there's like loads of like I've just read a book called Hook Point, which was pretty good.
Is that Eyal?
Oh, you're thinking of Hooked by Nir
Okay.
Eyal, which is a
Yeah.
great book. Hook Point is by Brendan Kane, I think
Okay.
it is. Yeah, so I think I've got 20 of them. Like I go through phases of like wanting to read and then phases of just wanting to watch YouTube videos. So I'm in a YouTube phase right now.
What do you
Oh, you
watch?
mentioned a lot of books in the training, I have to say. Every time I'm
Right.
like, I'm taking a note, this I
Yeah,
need
there's
to
a lot
read
of
this
recommendations.
one, that one. Yeah, tons of
Yeah.
books on my to-do list.
Yeah.
I want to ask you if it's okay, if you can share with us one of the less pleasant moments you have had as a community manager.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's been I think there's been a few. Like the one that immediately springs to mind because there was a learning in it, and I may have said this in CLC is years ago I was asked to do a keynote at OSCON, and it was a big deal for where I was in my career. It was like 5,000 people, all of my peers, and it was 10 minutes, and I was used to doing 45-minute talks. I've done loads of 30, 45-minute talks, and I really struggled to kind of put something meaningful together in 10 minutes. And I got on the stage and I did it, and it was bad. It was really bad. And I got off the stage. And the worst thing when you have that experience is you go to people and he's like, what did you think? And everyone's like, it was great. And you're like, no,
Oh,
listen, don't
boy.
lie to me. So anyway, a good friend of mine, Steve Wally, he said, look, some people are good at writing short stories. Some people are good at writing novels. You're good at writing novels. You just need to learn how to create a shorter talk, which was just profoundly helpful advice. So now I knew what I needed to do, but I was dealing with the embarrassment of I just humiliated myself in front of all my peers. So I went and wrote a blog post, and I basically said, I just keynoted OSCON and it sucked. And I explained what had happened. I wrote it. I hid in the corner of the Oregon Convention Center and wrote this blog post.
Nice.
And then I went and got really drunk that night. And it was ended up being a good experience because I learned a lot from that. And people came up, like the OSCON, like speaker committee came up and said that they were happy that I wrote that. So that was the moment that sucked.
I love that. I love that because you are really inspiring. So
Thank
to
you.
hear that even you can make those type of mistakes, it's good to hear, I have to say.
Yeah. Oh, there's lots of them.
Yeah,
um,
I think that showing vulnerability is actually a skill set. I mean,
I
being
agree.
able to do this,
It's a strength.
we're all humans. We all know what's going on in our head. It's not a surprise
Yeah.
that the same thing happened in your head, and the ability to share it. It's such an empowering and also kind of it removes a lot of walls between us. I really like that.
It's the only way we get better, right? Is
Right.
we've got to be honest with the reality we live in. So
Right.
Awesome.
So, Ravi, we have basically we ran out of time. Do you have any last question you want to ask John or John or anything
No, I
you
think
want to?
that was a good ending question, I think.
yeah. No, well, thank you. And I just got to say, you folks have been such a pleasure to have in the community leadership call. Revital is just constantly just kicking ass repeatedly. It's amazing. And congratulations on your fundraising, the whole deal. I think it's super cool what you're doing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you so
thanks
much,
for having me
John.
on.
Thank
Yes.
you so much.
Thank you very
All right.
much.